The storm came fast. One moment the mountains were silent, the next they were howling with wind and snow. The Sierra Nevada had a way of reminding people that they didn't belong here. Tonight was one of those nights. Inside a cabin half buried in white, a man worked to keep the fire alive. His name was Ethan Cross, 40 years old, former Special Forces, broad shoulders, tired eyes. He wasn't here to fight anymore. He was here to disappear. The logs crackled, but the fire struggled against the cold pressing in from every wall. The windows shook in their frames. Snow forced its way through every crack like the mountain itself wanted him gone. Ethan pulled his coat tighter and glanced at his only companion Shadow, a German shepherd, 9 years old, gray fur flecked with silver. The dog was calm in almost any situation, but tonight he wasn't. Shadow stood rigid near the stone fireplace, ears back, body tense. A low growl rumbled in his throat, not at the storm outside, but at something closer, something unseen. Ethan frowned. "What is it, boy?" The dog didn't move. He clawed at the stones near the hearth, whining in short bursts, then growled again. It wasn't the first time. For days now, Shadow had been restless around that spot. At first, Ethan thought it was just nerves, or maybe the scent of mice on the walls. But this was different. Tonight it felt urgent, like the dog was warning him. Ethan knelt down, pressing a hand to the cold stone, solid, ordinary, nothing there. Still, the look in Shadow's eyes unsettled him. The cabin was silent except for the storm outside, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the silence wasn't empty, that it was holding its breath. Watching, he stood, forcing the thought aside. "It's just the storm," he muttered. "That's all." But Shadow didn't believe it. His growl deepened, echoing in the small room like a warning too sharp to ignore. Outside, the wind screamed. Inside, the fire sputtered, and somewhere in the dark stone of the fireplace, a secret waited. Ethan didn't know it yet, but the storm outside wasn't the real threat. The real storm was already inside. Morning came gray and heavy. The storm had passed, leaving the mountains buried in silence. Ethan cross-saddled his old pickup, Shadow climbing into the passenger seat like he always did. The road down from the cabin was narrow, cut between walls of snow. Every turn felt like a reminder nature ruled here, not men. By noon, the small town of Pine Hollow appeared, a cluster of wooden buildings, faded signs, and a church steeple that leaned ever so slightly with age. Life here moved slow, but eyes always moved faster. Outsiders didn't come often, and Ethan, even after months of living nearby, was still an outsider. He parked near the town hall where the auction was being held. Shadow stayed close as they walked through the slush. Conversations paused as he passed. People whispered, some with curiosity, others with something colder suspicion. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp coats and coffee. A small crowd had gathered, their voices hushed. At the front, a man in a brown suit cleared his throat. Next on the list, the auctioneer announced, Ravenwood Place. The room shifted. Some crossed their arms, others avoided eye contact altogether. The name carried weight. Ethan raised his head. He had done his research. Ravenwood was a sprawling, but abandoned estate on the edge of town, overgrown, weather-beaten, forgotten. The kind of place nobody wanted except someone like him, a man who needed space and silence. Starting bid, $5,000. No one moved, not a single hand. A cough echoed, then whispers, "They say that place is cursed, ever since the fire. No one's stayed there long. Only a fool would want it." Ethan's hand went up. .com/steady. The auctioneer blinked. 5,000. Do I hear 6? Silence. People exchanged looks. Pity in some eyes, warnings in others. 5,000 going once, going twice. The gavel struck. Sold. To Mr. Ethan Cross. A ripple of murmurs swept the room. Some shook their heads. Others stared at him with the kind of look you give a man digging his own grave. Ethan signed the papers with little more than a nod. For him, it wasn't about what the town thought. He wasn't here for their approval. He was here for distance. 4 walls that would keep the world out. Ravenwood Place offered exactly that. But as he walked out, Shadow tight at his side, Ethan couldn't ignore the way people looked at him, like he'd just stepped into something he couldn't walk out of. The whispers followed him to the door. Ravenwood doesn't belong to the living anymore. Ethan pulled his coat tight, stepping back into the snow. He didn't believe in curses, but Shadow's ears twitched at the words, and for a brief moment, Ethan wondered if his dog knew something he didn't. The truck engine rumbled to life. The road to Ravenwood awaited, and so did whatever secrets it still held. The bell above the wooden door rang with a tired chime. Pine Hollow's general store smelled of tobacco, sawdust, and old paper. Shelves were lined with everything a mountain town needed: lantern oil, canned beans, rope. Behind the counter stood Walter Briggs, the kind of man whose face had been carved by years of mountain winters, white stubble eyes that had seen too much but spoke too little. Ethan pushed the door closed, brushing snow off his coat. Shadow padded in beside him, nose twitching at the smell of dried meat hanging near the register. "Afternoon," Walter said, voice gravelly, not unfriendly but not warm either. "You must be the one who bought Ravenwood. Word traveled fast here. Too fast." Ethan gave a slight nod. "That's me." Walter's eyes narrowed just a little, studying the man who had taken the place no one else dared touch. He reached under the counter, pulled out a ledger, but didn't open it. His fingers drummed on the wood. "You buy yourself a piece of land, sure, but land remembers things. Sometimes, it don't forget." Ethan tilted his head. "You mean the fire?" Walter let out a breath, somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "Fire, yes, but that's only part of it. You ever hear the name Henry Raven?" Ethan stayed quiet. Walter leaned forward, elbows on the counter. 16 years ago, Henry Ravenwood lived in that house. He wasn't just some local. He was a journalist, sharp one, too. Came from the city. Folks said he was chasing something big, something tied to SilverPeak Mining. The name hung in the air. SilverPeak. Ethan had seen it on old signs, rusting near abandoned shafts in the mountains. Walter's voice dropped lower. "That company used to run this town. Promised jobs, money, progress. What they left was sickness, empty pockets, and holes in the ground. Henry wanted to expose them. Said he had evidence, tapes, interviews. Then one night, he just vanished." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Vanished? How?" "No one knows. Some say he skipped town. Others say SilverPeak made sure he never spoke another word." And then Walter gestured toward the north, where Ravenwood Place stood. The fire, whole estate lit up in the night. By the time folks got there, the place was half ash. No sign of Henry, no body, just rumors. Shadow gave a low growl, as if the word itself stirred something. Walter's eyes flicked to the dog before returning to Ethan. "After that, things changed. People started hearing noises near the ruins, windows slamming shut when no wind blew, lights flickering in the trees. Hunters swore they saw a man standing on the balcony, even though the balcony was burned to the ground. Word spread fast. Haunted, they called it. Cursed, whatever you want to name it. Folks kept their distance." Ethan stayed silent. Listening, Walter studied him carefully. "You don't strike me as the type who scares easy," Walter said. "But you should know Pine Hollow. Don't forget Henry Ravenwood. Some say his spirit still walks that estate, looking for the truth he never got to tell. Others," Walter leaned closer, "others say the truth itself is buried there, waiting for someone reckless enough to dig it up." Ethan finally spoke. "And what do you believe?" Walter leaned back, crossing his arms. "Belief don't change what's real. All I know is, every man who tried living in Ravenwood since the fire didn't last long. Some left in the dead of night, never looked back. One feller, he hung himself in the barn." The store grew quieter. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hesitate. Walter broke the silence, voice low. "Henry Ravenwood wanted justice. SilverPeak wanted silence. And what we got instead was a story nobody dares to finish." Ethan picked up a pack of coffee and a box of cartridges from the shelf. He set them on the counter. "Maybe it's time someone did." Walter's eyes sharpened. "Careful what you go looking for, Mr. Cross. Around here, truth ain't just dangerous, it's contagious. Once it gets in your blood, it don't let go." Shadow barked once, sharp and sudden, as if to cut through the tension. Walter bagged the supplies, sliding them across the counter. "If you're set on staying in Ravenwood, I'd suggest you keep your dog close. Sometimes, animals see things men can't." Ethan nodded, took the bag, and turned for the door. The bell chimed again as he stepped into the snow. The street outside was empty, but the air felt heavier, as if Walter's words had settled on his shoulders like fresh snow. Ravenwood wasn't just a house. It was a wound, a scar that hadn't healed in 16 years. As Ethan climbed into the truck, Shadow leaped up beside him, eyes fixed on the distant ridge where the estate lay hidden in trees and shadow. The engine growled to life. Whatever waited in Raven, Ethan knew it wasn't just whispers or ghost stories. It was something darker, tied to men with power and secrets they'd killed to keep. And now, for better or worse, it was his. The drive back up the mountain was slow and bone-rattling. Snow had thickened into heavy sheets, blurring the road, erasing the edges of the world. Ethan's headlights cut tunnels through the white, but everything beyond them was shadows and silence. Shadows sat stiff in the passenger seat, ears pricked forward, eyes never leaving the windshield. The dog's posture was tense, as though he expected something to leap from the darkness at any moment. Relax, Ethan muttered, though his own jaw was tight. It's just a storm. But even as he said it, he knew storms didn't make a dog act this way. By the time the truck crawled up the final ridge and the cabin came into view, the wind had sharpened into a howl, clawing at the timbers of the old house. Ethan pulled up, killed the engine, and for a moment just sat, listening. The storm pressed against the windows, an endless rush of snow and air. Yet beneath it, he swore he could hear something else. A faint thud, a creak, almost like footsteps inside. Shadow growled, low and steady. Ethan grabbed his pack, slung the rifle over his shoulder, and opened the door. Snow slapped his face, ice biting against skin. The dog leaped out first, landing silent as a shadow, nose pressed to the ground. Together they pushed into the storm, boots crunching toward the cabin door. Inside, the air was stale and cold. The fire had died, leaving only ash. Ethan kicked the door shut behind him, set down the pack, and struck a match to relight the logs. Orange flames spread, chasing away the dog, but not the unease. Shadow didn't settle by the fire like usual. Instead, he circled the room, nose to the floorboards, muscles taut. He stopped in front of the stone fireplace, ears flattened, tail stiff, and gave a sharp bark. Ethan frowned. Not this again. 2 nights ago, the dog had done the same scratching, whining, pacing in front of the hearth like something was trapped behind it. Ethan had chalked it up to nerves, maybe even the smell of a mouse nest. But now, after Walter's story, the thoughts sat heavier. He crouched, running a hand along the rough stone. Cold grit clung to his palm. He pressed against one of the slabs, half expecting it to shift. Nothing. Shadow barked again, claws scraping at the seam between hearth and floorboards. His growl rumbled through the cabin. "All right," Ethan said, his voice quieter than he meant. "Show me." He dragged the rug aside, revealing old wood darkened by smoke and years. He tapped the planks with the butt of his knife. Hollow, his pulse quickened. Kneeling, he found a small notch almost invisible, worn smooth by time. He wedged the knife tip in and pried. The plank groaned, then lifted, revealing a square of black. A draft of cold air rose up, carrying the smell of stone and iron, a hidden crawl space, maybe more. Shadow shoved his nose toward the opening. Whining now, urgent. Ethan aimed the flashlight into the void. Stairs, narrow, steep, vanishing into darkness. For a long moment, he didn't move. Walter's words echoed in his head. The truth itself is buried there, waiting for someone reckless enough to dig it up. Was this what Shadow had been trying to tell him? Not ghosts, not curses. A secret Henry Ravenwood had hidden 16 years ago. The storm howled louder, battering the walls as if urging him to go down. To see for himself, Ethan's grip tightened on the flashlight. Not tonight. He lowered the plank back into place and slid the rug over it. Whatever waited below could wait another day. Right now, he needed a fire, warmth, sleep. He needed to think. Shadow didn't agree. The dog paced, the rug, claws ticking, eyes fixed on the hidden seam. He barked again, sharp and insistent, until Ethan snapped, "Enough." The sound echoed in the small cabin, harsher than he intended. Shadow froze, then slunk back to the corner, ears drooping. Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. "I'm sorry, boy. Not tonight." He settled by the fire, poured a splash of whiskey into a tin cup, and stared into the flames. But the warmth didn't ease him. His mind turned over and over Henry Raven, SilverPeak, the fire, the rumors, and now, the crawl space under his own cabin. The storm raged through the night, shaking the shutters, rattling the roof. Every sound pressed against Ethan's nerves. Every creak of timber sounded like someone moving just beyond the door. Sleep came in fragments, broken by the wind and Shadow's restless pacing. At one point, near midnight, Ethan opened his eyes to find the dog standing by the hearth again, body rigid, staring at the rug, growling. And for the first time, Ethan thought he saw it too, a faint flicker of light, just for an instant, leaking up through the cracks in the floor. By morning, when the storm finally broke, Ethan knew one thing with certainty. This wasn't about ghosts. Ghosts didn't leave blueprints. Ghosts didn't hide files. Whatever lay beneath his cabin was real, and it was waiting. The storm had passed, leaving the morning brittle and silent. Snow lay thick across the ridge, glittering under a weak sun. From the outside, the cabin looked almost peaceful, but inside, Ethan couldn't shake the weight of what he had seen the night before, the flicker of light beneath the rug, the way Shadow had stood guard as if against something unseen. He had tried to sleep it off, but there was no ignoring it anymore. Whatever was buried under the cabin wasn't going to leave him alone. Shadows seemed to know it too. The dog was already pacing by the fireplace when Ethan rose. His claws clicked against the floorboards, stopping at the same spot, eyes fixed on the seam beneath the rug. "All right," Ethan muttered, pulling on his jacket. "Let's finish this." He slid the rug aside, exposing the darkened planks. The knife found the notch again, prying open the hatch with a groan of old wood. A rush of cold, stale air seeped up, heavy with the smell of damp earth and rust. Shadow growled, ears pinned. But he didn't back away. Instead, he stepped closer, nose twitching toward the blackness below. Ethan clicked on his flashlight. The beam cut down a narrow flight of stairs, stone walls pressed tight on both sides. Slick with condensation, dust floated in the air, disturbed after years of silence. One step, then another. The boards underfoot creaked as he started down. Shadow followed, hoarse, steady but tense. The deeper they went, the colder it grew. The air thickened, carrying the metallic tang of iron and something older, something that reminded Ethan of abandoned bunkers overseas, places where time had stopped and shadows held their own memories. At the bottom, his boots touched stone. The beam swept across the basement. It wasn't large, but the space pressed in like a tomb. Low ceiling walls of rough-hewn rock, lined with rusted shelves, cobwebs hung in sheets, trembling with each breath of stale air. Shadow's ears flicked, catching every sound. Ethan's own pulse thundered in his ears. Against the far walls stood an iron cabinet, the paint long gone, its frames streaked with rust. A padlock, corroded but still intact, dangled from the latch. Ethan approached slowly, life gliding over scattered objects along the floor. Broken glass jars, a rusted lantern, piles of papers, half-rotted, gnawed by mice. Shadow sniffed one pile, sneezed, then pawed at the dirt near the cabinet. Ethan crouched. His fingers brushed something hard beneath a thin layer of soil. He dug it free, a metal box, small and dented, its surface mottled with age. The latch was broken. He pried it open. Inside lay a reel of old cassette tapes, each labeled with a name and a date. The ink faded but still legible. "Interviews," Ethan whispered. He lifted one tape, turned it in the light. "SilverPeak, March 2009, shadow wind, circling the cabinet." "All right," Ethan said. He stood, yanking at the padlock. Rust crumbled in his hands, but the lock held. With a grunt, he slammed the butt of his rifle against it. Once, twice, the metal cracked, then snapped free. The door screeched open. Inside, files stacked high filled the shelves, folders, notebooks, even maps rolled tight with twine. Some had yellowed to the color of old bone. Others were water-damaged, edges curling, but they were still here, still intact. Ethan pulled one file free, brushed the dust off the cover. Typed letters spelled the name Henry Ray. Inside, he found pages of notes, newspaper clippings, photographs of mine shafts and waste ponds, children coughing in hospital beds. His jaw tightened. Walter Briggs hadn't been spinning stories. Ravenwood had been building a case against SilverPeak Mining. Shadow barked once, sharp and quick. The sound bounced off the stone, echoing like gunfire. Ethan spun. Flashlight beam sweeping the corners. Nothing, just stone and dust. But the dog's hackles were raised, his body rigid. Ethan whispered, "Easy." The dog didn't relax. He kept staring toward the farthest corner of the basement, where the darkness seemed thicker. Ethan aimed the light there. For an instant, he thought he saw movement, a shifting shadow, a ripple where there should be none. He blinked. Nothing, only the damp stone wall. Still, the cold deepened. The air felt heavier, pressing against his lungs. He shoved the files back into the cabinet, slammed the door, and shouldered his pack. He tucked the tapes into it, slipping them between spare magazines. "We got what we came for," he muttered, though a part of him knew this was only the beginning. Shadow backed toward the stairs, growled low in his throat. Ethan followed, climbing fast, the beam jerking across the walls. The hatch above looked like salvation. He pushed through, pulling the plank shut, sliding the rug back over it. For a long moment, he stood there, chest heaving, listening. The cabin creaked, the wind whispered against the shutters, but from below, faint as breath, came the echo of a sound he couldn't mistake, a thud, then another, like footsteps. Ethan froze, hand tightening on the rifle. Shadow pressed close, his body trembling with tension. Whatever secrets Henry Ravenwood had buried down there, they weren't buried alone. The storm had quieted, but inside the cabin the weight of the basement clung to Ethan like smoke. He spread the contents of his pack across the wooden table. Battered folders, damp maps, the small cassette reels. Shadow lay nearby, head on his paws, eyes fixed on the pile as if he understood the gravity of what sat there. Ethan opened the first folder. Pages slid free, yellow and brittle at the edges. Ravenwood's handwriting was jagged, hurried, as if written by a man racing against time. SilverPeak Mining front for a deeper network. Leaks show they pay county officials to bury reports. Water samples indicate contamination. Local children developing unexplained illnesses. No hospital will speak on record. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had seen the same in other corners of the world, villages poisoned by greed, silenced by fear. Now it was here, carved into the bones of Pine Hollow. He flipped to the next page. Photographs, black and white images of mine shafts collapsed in on themselves. Rivers running dark, cattle lying dead in open fields. Then a shot of the Ravenwood estate before the fire. Henry Ravenwood stood on the porch, coat buttoned tight, a pen in his hand instead of a weapon. His face was lean, eyes sharp. A man who believed truth was armor enough. Shadow winded softly, shifting closer. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's head without looking away from the photo. The next folder was thicker. Inside, official documents bore the SilverPeak letterhead, stamped with dates and signatures, contracts, payoffs, county inspectors marked as consultants, their reports rewritten to erase words like toxic or unsafe. Bank statements tracked money funneling through shell accounts, ending in the names of men Ethan had seen standing in the Pine Hollow courthouse. Corruption wasn't whispered rumor, it was black ink on paper. He unfolded one of the maps. Red lines cut through the Sierra Nevada like scars, marking mines, tunnels, and waste pits. In the margins, Ravenwood had scrawled notes: unreported shaft collapsed, tree dead, acid drainage creek poisoned, children sick, no coverage. Ethan exhaled through his nose. This was more than one man's investigation. It was an indictment. He reached for the metal box, lifting a cassette tape. The plastic was cold. The label faded. Interview M. Torres, 2009. He dug out an old player from a drawer. He had kept it for field recordings, a relic of missions past. The tape clicked into place. Static crackled, then a voice, weak, trembling, but clear enough. They told us to dump it in the river. Said no one would notice, but the fish died first. Then my daughter started coughing. Doctor wouldn't write it down. Said it was nothing, but it was everything. It was SilverPeak, the tape hissed. Then cut. Ethan sat motionless. He inserted another. Henry, they came to my house, told me to shut up or I'd lose my job. I told them I didn't care. Next day, my truck was burned out on the road. My wife begged me to stop, but I can't stop. People are dying here. Click. Another tape. They paid the sheriff. Everyone knows it. He clears their trucks. No inspections. Kids drink the water, and he looks the other way. This isn't mining. It's murder. Ethan stopped the tape. The silence that followed was louder than any storm. Shadow lifted his head, ears pricked, sensing the shift in his master's heartbeat. Ethan leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling beams. He could almost feel Ravenwood in the room, the man's presence etched into every page, every reel. 16 years gone, but his fight's still alive, trapped in ink and tape. And now, in Ethan's hands, he understood the weight of it. This wasn't just evidence. It was a burden. Ravenwood had carried it until it broke him. Now it had passed on, and Ethan felt its claws digging into him the same way his own past admissions no one remembered. Names written only on classified files. Ghosts of his own making. He poured a shot of whiskey, the burn grounding him. The fire popped in the hearth, but its warmth didn't reach him. Walter Briggs had been right. The land didn't forget, and neither did men like Henry Red. Ethan gathered the files back into neat stacks, slid the tapes into his pack. He needed to move carefully. If SilverPeak still had reached in, he knew they did. These documents were dynamite. Men had killed for less. Shadows sat up, ears twitching at a sound outside, a branch cracking, footsteps in the snow. Ethan froze, hand drifting to the rifle, leaning against the wall. The dog growled, low and certain. Ethan held his breath. Silence followed, just a mountain settling under its blanket of ice. But he knew better. Once you uncovered a secret like this, the world shifted. Someone, somewhere, would know, and they would come. The night storm howled with a violence that felt alive, as if the mountain itself had chosen to test the cabin's strength. Wind slammed against the timber walls, rattling the shutters, forcing snow into the smallest cracks. The fire in the hearth fought back with its own fury, sparks rising like tiny spirits before vanishing into the darkness above. Ethan sat at the rough wooden table. Ravenwood's journal spread open under the flickering light of a lantern. The pages smelled of mildew and dust, words pressed deep into the paper as though the man had carved them there with sheer desperation. Phrases repeated over and over again. They know. They are watching. SilverPeak owns this valley. The words were heavy, and they dragged Ethan into thoughts he didn't want to revisit. thoughts of missions gone wrong, of comrades silenced because they had seen too much. He rubbed the back of his neck, trying to push those memories aside. A low growl cut through his thoughts. Shadow was at the door again, hackles raised, nose pressed hard against the crack near the floor. The dog's body was tensed, rigid, vibrating with a restrained energy Ethan knew well. This wasn't a false alarm. Easy boy, Ethan whispered. He closed the journal and stood, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle leaning against the wall. At first all he heard was the storm, the endless roar of wind, the crack of tree branches bending under ice. But then, faint beneath it, a sound that didn't belong, a muffled crunch. Then another, rhythmic, deliberate, footsteps. Ethan froze. Every sense sharpened. He moved to the window and peeled the curtain back a sliver. Snow blurred most of the world, but between the rushing white, a figure flickered, a shadow among trees, still, watching. The curtain fell back into place. Ethan raised the rifle, heart steady, breathing controlled. His training returned. Without thought measured the threat. Calculate distance. Prepare for engagement. Another crunch of snow. Closer this time. Shadow growled louder, his teeth bared, gaze fixed on the door. Ethan crossed to it, pulling the iron latch free. The wind roared in as he pushed it open, a crack, icy air biting at his face. He stepped onto the porch, the storm lashing at his coat. At first, nothing, just the white chaos of the blizzard. Then he looked down. Footprints. A trail of deep, heavy prints curved around the cabin, weaving through the snow. Fresh edges still sharp, not yet blurred by new flakes. They circled the structure and disappeared back into the dark forest. No lantern glow, no horse tracks, no snowmobile. Whoever had come had done so on foot, in the middle of a killing storm. That alone told Ethan this was no lost hiker. He crouched, pressing a gloved hand into one of the prints. Large boot, maybe military issue, size 10 or 11, still crisps no more than 5 minutes old. Shadow's growl deepened, the dog's gaze fixed on the tree line. Ethan raised the rifle, sighting through the iron notch into the storm. His voice was calm but cold, carried just far enough to be heard. Show yourself. The wind devoured his words. No movement came, only the storm answering back. After a long moment, Ethan backed inside, shutting the door and throwing the lock. The fire's warmth now felt distant, fragile against the weight of the night pressing in. He set the rifle on the table but kept one hand resting on it. His eyes returned to the journal, the maps, the stack of evidence against SilverPeak. His gut told him this wasn't a coincidence. Ravenwood had been silent 16 years ago, and now Ethan had the same documents, the same truth someone out there already knew. The night dragged on. Ethan stayed awake, forcing his body into stillness. Listening, every creak of the cabin drew his eyes. Every shift in the storm made his pulse quicken. Shadow paced the floor, restless, ears twitching at sounds too faint for human ears. At some point, exhaustion claimed him. His head nodded against the chair, the rifle resting across his knees. The fire had sunk low, glowing embers casting the room in a soft red light. Scratch. His eyes snapped open. The sound had not come from inside. It came from the window. He rose silently, rifle ready, and crept toward the frosted glass. A smear cut through the frost, wide and wet, as though a hand had dragged slowly across the outside surface. Shadow barked once, sharp and furious, leaping toward the window. Ethan ripped the curtain back, barrel raised and nothing, just snow swirling endlessly in the storm. But the smear remained, the trace of touch. Human. He let the curtain fall, jaw tight, mind racing. Whoever was out there had been close enough to reach the window, close enough to watch him sleep, and bold enough to leave a mark behind. He checked the door again, sliding the heavy bar across. His breath misted in the cold air that seeped through the cracks. This wasn't paranoia. The signs were undeniable. Footprints circling the cabin, the shadow among the trees, the smear across the glass. Someone was out there. They wanted him to know it. Ethan crouched near the fire, feeding him to another log. He looked down at Shadow, who pressed close against his leg, body tense but loyal as ever. "We'll be ready," Ethan whispered. The storm raged on, slamming against the cabin, but inside, a different storm brewed, silent, calculated, waiting. Ethan knew these were only warnings, and warnings always came before the real attack. The mountain no longer felt vast and lonely. It felt tight, suffocating, as if the forest itself had closed around him. The message was clear. He was not alone, and the game had already begun. The storm had eased by morning, though the mountain still wore its white armor. Sunlight fractured through the clouds, painting the forest in sharp contrasts of blue shadow and blinding white. The world looked almost pure again, as if the violence of the night had been erased. Almost. Ethan Cross knew better. The footprints, the smear on the window, The unseen watcher and the storm. Those weren't illusions. They were preludes, and preludes always had a main act. He moved through the cabin quietly, coffee mug in hand, eyes drifting to the rifle resting near the door. Shadow sat by the hearth, head cocked, ears turning with every distant sound. The dog was on edge, and Ethan trusted Shadow's instincts more than the mountain's deceptive calm. By midday, the sound of an engine broke the stillness, not the muffled rattle of an old truck like his own. This was deeper, steadier, industrial. A black SUV emerged from the trees, tires chewing through the snow-packed road, chrome grille glinting like a sneer. Ethan stepped onto the porch, coat pulled tight. Shadow followed, lips curled in a low growl. The SUV stopped a dozen yards from the cabin. For a long moment, its tinted windows reflected only forest and sky. Then the driver's door opened. A man stepped out, tall, broad shoulders, expensive black overcoat, the kind of man who looked out of place in the wilderness, yet utterly comfortable standing in it. His hair was close-cropped military style, but streaked with gray at the temples. Sunglasses masked his eyes, though Ethan didn't need to see them to know the type. The walk told the story, calm, controlled, predatory. He stopped at the base of the porch steps. His voice carried easily in the crisp mountain air. "Ethan Cross." Ethan didn't reply. His hand rested casually against the porch railing, but every muscle was ready. The man removed his sunglasses, tucking them into his coat pocket. His eyes were sharp, pale blue, the kind that saw weakness like wolves smell blood. "Name's Cole Harrington. I work security for SilverPeak Mining." He smiled faintly, but the smile never reached his eyes. "You've caused us a little concern." Ethan tilted his head. "I've been living quiet. Don't see how I've concerned anyone." Cole's gaze flicked toward the cabin. "Quiet, sure, except for poking around places that don't belong to you. Ravenwood Place isn't just some fixer-upper, Mr. Cross. It's history best left to rot." Shadow growled low. Stepping forward, Cole's eyes dropped briefly to the dog, then back up, unshaken. Ethan's tone stayed even. "Funny. I thought land up for auction meant it was fair game." Cole's smile widened a fraction, sharp as broken glass. "You bought dirt. Congratulations. What you didn't buy are the problems buried under it." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, though the words carried like a blade. "Walk away, sell it back, burn the deed. I don't care. Just disappear before you make this harder than it needs to be." The mountain wind whispered through the trees, but the silence between the men was louder. Ethan met Cole's gaze unblinking. "And if I don't?" For the first time, Cole's smile faded. His jaw tightened, and something colder replaced the polished calm. "Then you'll lose everything." His eyes flicked toward the cabin again. "That dog, that quiet life you're clinging to, even your skin." "If you push me far enough, SilverPeak doesn't forgive trespasses," Shadow barked, the sound exploding in the stillness. Cole didn't flinch, but his hand slid casually into his coat pocket, as though reminding Ethan there were options besides conversation. Ethan shifted his weight, voice steady as stone. "You think threats scare me?" Cole chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Not threats. Cross, promises." The two men stood locked in silence, winter air crystallizing between them. The tension was thick, electric, like the moment before lightning struck. Finally, Cole stepped back, pulling his sunglasses from his pocket and sliding them on. "You've got one chance. Do the smart thing, pack up, be gone by the end of the week." He turned toward the SUV, boots crunching in the snow. Halfway there, he paused, speaking without looking back. "Ravenwood thought he could fight us. 16 years later, they still haven't found his body. Think about that." "Cross." The SUV roared to life, tires spitting snow as it backed down the path and vanished into the trees. Silence swallowed the clearing again. Ethan stood on the porch, Shadow pressed close to his leg, his heartbeat steady, but his mind churned. Cole Harrington wasn't just muscle. He was a message. SilverPeak was watching. They wanted him gone, and if he stayed, they'd come harder. He glanced at the cabin, the hearth still glowing faintly through the window, at the journal on the table, filled with the dead man's words, at the mountains rising eternal around him. Ethan knew what Cole wanted him to do. Walk away. Forget the land. Forget the truth. But Ethan Cross wasn't built to walk away. He knelt, running a hand along Shadow's neck, studying the dog's trembling growl. His voice was quiet, but resolute. "They're afraid of what's buried here, boy, which means we're right where we need to be." The storm clouds were gathering again on the horizon, dark and heavy. Ethan felt it in his bones. This wasn't over. Harrington would be back, and next time, he wouldn't come alone. The storm returned that evening, a relentless curtain of white sweeping across the valley. Snow lashed against the cabin windows, but inside, the fire burned hot, its glow spilling across the table where Ethan worked. The journal lay open, alongside maps and brittle documents. Ravenwood's handwriting filled the pages, details of meetings, coded references to SilverPeak's bribes, sketches of mining sites bleeding poison into rivers. Ethan had spent hours combing through the evidence, piecing together the story of a man who'd tried to fight a giant and paid the price. Now, Ethan knew what had to be done. Shadow lay at his feet, ears twitching in restless sleep. The dog had sensed it before. Ethan admitted that this fight wasn't about land anymore. It was about truth, about making sure Ravenwood hadn't died for nothing. Ethan opened his laptop, the satellite uplink flickering weakly in the storm. The old machine groaned to life, screen casting a cold glow over the papers. He slipped a USB drive into the port, fingers moving with calm precision as he scanned, copied, and saved. Each file, each page, each map was preserved, digital lifelines in case the originals were destroyed. When the drive was full, he opened his email. His contact list was short, almost empty, but one name remained: Sarah Mitchell. He hadn't spoken to her in years. Once, they'd been close before the deployments, before the ghosts. She'd gone on to become an investigative journalist in Denver, chasing truths in ink and headlines while he chased shadows with a rifle. If anyone could carry this torch, it was her. Ethan typed quickly. No flourishes, no wasted words. Sarah, I don't have time to explain everything. Encrypted files attached. They belonged to Arthur Ravenwood, missing 16 years. He was right, SilverPeak is dirty. Bribes, pollution, cover-ups, the works. I need you to publish if something happens to me. Trust no one but your editor. If you hear my name in the news, you'll know why. Ethan, he attached the files, compressed and encrypted, layering the same security he'd once used in the field. It wouldn't stop SilverPeak's best tech, but it would slow them down long enough for Sarah to act. His finger hovered for a moment over the send button. This was the point of no return. Then he clicked. The progress bar crawled across the screen. Outside, the wind howled as if the mountain itself resisted the transmission. Finally, the window pinged, message sent. Ethan leaned back, exhaling slow. The weight in his chest eased, but only slightly. A copy of the truth was safe now, beyond his reach, beyond SilverPeak's grasp. He closed the laptop, tucking the USB drive into a hollow behind the cabin's stone hearth, a fallback in case the digital trail failed. Shadow stirred. Lifting his head, eyes glowing amber in the firelight, Ethan crouched beside him, hand firm on the dog's neck. We've started something now, he said quietly. No turning back. The dog's ears twitched. As if he understood, Ethan stood, checking his rifle, laying spare magazines on the table. He unrolled a canvas kit, each piece of gear laid out with the order of habit: knife, compass, field radio, flare. Old routines returning, as natural as breath. Cole Harrington's words echoed in his mind. You'll lose everything. Ethan wasn't naive. He knew Harrington would come back, and not with polite warnings this time. Men like him didn't bluff, they executed. The visit had been a courtesy. The last one. The storm outside raged on, but Ethan felt a sharper storm gathering within. He wasn't Ravenwood. He had training, instincts, and a partner who would never abandon him. But like Raven, he was standing against something bigger, colder, and far more dangerous than any single man. He walked to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to see the dark forest beyond. Snow swirled endlessly, but somewhere out there, he could feel the weight of eyes, watching, waiting. Ethan let the curtain fall. He stoked the fire, the flames leaping higher, reflecting in his eyes like embers of resolve. He had sent the truth out into the world. Now, all that remained was to defend it. The storm returned like a hammer, pounding the mountainside with sheets of snow and wind that clawed at the cabin walls. It was the kind of night no sane man would be out in, which is why Ethan knew they would come. He had been preparing since Harrington's visit. Extra ammunition loaded, escape routes marked, gear laid out with the precision of old habits. Now, in the howl of the storm, he waited, shadow paced by the door, ears high, body trembling with anticipation. The dog had been restless since dusk, every sense warning of what was coming. It began with a sound almost lost in the wind, a faint crunch of snow where no one should be walking. Then another, then many. Ethan's breath slowed. His fingers tightened around the rifle. Through the storm he glimpsed movement, shadows among shadows, men in dark parkas, rifles in their hands, fanning out across the tree line. 4, maybe 5, the kind of men who didn't get lost in storms. The kind sent by Harrington. The first shot shattered the silence, punching into the cabin wall with a crack of splintering wood. Shadow barked furiously, the sound echoing like thunder inside the small room. Ethan rolled to the side, staying low. He didn't fire back immediately. Not yet. Instead, he moved to the lantern, snuffing it out with a flick of his fingers. Darkness swallowed the room, leaving only the flicker of the hearth. "Let them come," he whispered. Another shot tore through the window. Glass scattered across the floor. Snow whirled in through the gap, carried on the storm. Ethan countered the rhythm of the gunfire. Quick bursts, suppressive. They were trying to pin him down, which meant at least one was circling to flank. He motioned to Shadow, hand signals sharp and silent. The dog crouched low, muscles coiled. A thud hit the back door, then another. They were testing the locks, forcing their way in. Ethan moved fast. He positioned himself along the angle of the doorframe, rifle raised, breath measured. When the latch snapped and the door burst inward, a man in black stepped through. Weapon up. Ethan fired once. The shot cracked like thunder, and the intruder dropped before he hit the floor. Shadow lunged immediately, slamming into the second man behind him, teeth sinking into an arm. The rifle clattered to the ground as the attacker screamed. Ethan pivoted, delivering a second controlled shot. Silence returned, broken only by the storm and the growl of Shadow's jars. 2 down. More outside. Gunfire erupted again, this time from the tree line, bullets punching into the walls. Ethan ducked low, moving across the cabin in the shadows. He knew staying inside meant death. The cabin was wood and stone, but even stone cracked under enough fire. He grabbed his pack, slinging it across his back. Then he opened the trapdoor he'd discovered under the Ravenwood's hidden passage. Not deep, not far, but enough to get outside unseen. "Shadow," he whispered. The dog released his grip, muzzle slick, and bounded to his side. They slipped into the passage, crawling through the dark, until the wooden hatch at the far end opened into the storm. Snow bit his face, freezing his breath into ice, but outside, the hunters hadn't seen them yet. Ethan moved through the snow like a ghost, circling behind the attackers. He counted 3 silhouettes against the faint glow of the cabin's windows. He dropped to one knee, rifle steady, and fired. One man fell instantly. Another staggered with a shout. The third spun, firing wildly into the storm. Ethan was already gone, moving to another position. Shadow darted through the snow, vanishing and reappearing like a phantom. The wounded man screamed once before Shadow silenced him with teeth and fury. Gunfire rattled the night again, but now it was panicked, undisciplined. Ethan flanked wide, closing distance, using the storm as cover. He fired once more, and the last attacker dropped into the snow, silence following in his wake. For a moment, the only sound was the storm. Ethan crouched, scanning the tree line, rifle ready, but no more figures moved. No more shots came. He exhaled slowly, for bodies lay in the snow. One inside the cabin. The attack had failed. Shadow returned to his side, fur bristling, muzzle flecked with snow and blood. The dog pressed close, chest heaving but eyes bright. Ethan rested a hand on his head, steadying him. "Good boy." They stood together in the storm, the cabin behind them scarred with bullet holes and broken glass, but it still stood, and so did they. Ethan knew this wasn't the end. Harrington hadn't come himself, he'd sent pawns, which meant the real fight was still ahead. The storm howled louder, as if echoing the truth. SilverPeak had declared war, and Ethan Cross was ready to answer. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the mountains smothered in white silence. The snow glistened like a sheet of glass, covering the scars of the night's battle. For a moment, the world seemed calm. Ethan stood outside the cabin, rifle slung across his shoulder, Shadow at his side. His body ached from the fight, but his mind was sharper than ever. They had survived the ambush. That meant Cole Harrington would not stop. The first hint came as a thin curl of smoke. Ethan noticed it against the pale sky, smoke rising not from the chimney, but from under the eaves. His chest tightened. "Shadow inside," he barked. The dog darted toward the cabin. Ethan followed, yanking the door open. A wall of heat slammed into him. The fire had started in the kitchen, flames licking hungrily at the walls, spreading fast. Someone had torched the cabin. Damn it. Ethan pulled his jacket over his face, forcing his way through the growing inferno. The air was already thick with smoke, clawing at his lungs. He heard Shadow barking, somewhere deeper in the cabin. "Trapped. Hold on, boy." Ethan coughed. Eyes stinging, he dropped low, crawling beneath the smoke. The fire roared around him, devouring the wooden beams like dry kindling. He reached the study, where Ravenwood's journals and the damning documents lay spread across the desk. Flames were already curling at the edges of the papers. Ethan swept them into his pack, slapping away sparks with his bare hand. Pain seared his palm, but he didn't let go. Then he heard it, the bark turning into a desperate whine. Shadow was pinned behind a collapsed beam in the corner. The flames crackled around him, cutting off escape. Ethan's blood surged. He heaved at the burning timber, muscles straining. The heat blistered his arms, but he forced the beam aside. Shadow bolted free, leaping into Ethan's arms. "Got you," Ethan rasped, coughing through the smoke. The cabin groaned. The roof was collapsing. They had seconds, maybe less. Ethan clutched Shadow, pack slung over his shoulder, and dove through the nearest window. Glass shattered, and they tumbled into the snow, rolling hard behind them. The cabin erupted. Flames leaped skyward, black smoke twisting like a serpent into the dawn. Ravenwood's refuge, Ethan's last safe haven, was gone, and standing at the edge of the clearing, watching it burn, was Cole Harrington. He looked untouched by the storm, his black coat billowing in the wind, his eyes fixed coldly on Ethan. A pistol gleamed in his hand. "You should have listened," Harrington called over the roar of the fire. "I gave you a chance to walk away." Ethan rose slowly, setting Shadow behind him. His rifle was gone in the fire. Only the combat knife remained strapped to his belt. "You sent your men to kill me in the dark," Ethan said, voice hoarse. "They didn't come back." Harrington's jaw tightened. He leveled the pistol. "Then I'll finish the job myself." The standoff stretched, fire crackling behind Ethan, snow crunching beneath their boots. Two men, bound by violence and fate, facing each other at last. Harrington fired. Ethan dove aside, the bullet sparking off a stone. He rolled, came up fast, and hurled his knife. Harrington twisted, the blade grazing his arm, making him drop the pistol into the snow. They closed the distance in an instant. Fists met flesh. Ethan's training surged back, strikes sharp and efficient. Each blow meant to end it. But Harrington wasn't just muscled, he was fast, ruthless, fighting with the desperation of a cornered predator. A punch to Ethan's ribs stole his breath. A knee slammed into his gut, but he countered with a headbutt, then drove Harrington back with a brutal elbow. Snow flew as they grappled, slipping, rolling, slamming each other into the ground. The fire cast their shadows across the clearing. Two figures locked in primal combat. Harrington clawed for his pistol. Ethan pinned his wrist, forcing it into the snow with his other hand. Harrington reached for a knife on his belt, slashing wildly. The blade nipped Ethan's cheek, drawing blood. Rage flared. Ethan slammed his forearm into Harrington's throat, forcing him down. They struggled, snow kicking up in a frenzy. Shadow barked furiously at the edge of the fight, circling, waiting for Ethan's signal. Harrington broke free for a heartbeat, lunging for the pistol. His fingers brushed the grip, but Shadow leapt, jaws clamping on Harrington's arm, dragging him back with a roar of pain. That split second was all Ethan needed. He ripped the knife from Harrington's hand and pressed it to his throat, pinning him flat in the snow. Harrington froze, chest heaving, blood staining his coat. His eyes burned with hatred but also fear. "It's over," Ethan growled. "You wanted to burn the truth, but now you'll carry it with you." Harrington spat blood, sneering. "You don't have the guts." Ethan's grip tightened, but he didn't finish it. Killing Harrington would bury the truth in blood. Keeping him alive meant exposing SilverPeak with its own enforcer as proof. He tied Harrington's hands with cord from his pack, wrenching his arms tight behind his back. The once feared enforcer lay bound in the snow, defeated, powerless. Shadow stood tall beside Ethan, hackles bristling, watching their enemy with cold eyes. Behind them, the Ravenwood cabin collapsed in a final roar, sending sparks spiraling into the sky. Its walls were gone, but its fire had lit something new. A war Ethan was ready to finish. He hauled Harrington to his feet. "You're going to talk, every name, every deal, every secret, for the first time." Harrington didn't answer with a threat, only silence, and in that silence, Ethan knew the fight was far from over, but tonight, he had won. The world didn't change with gunfire this time, it changed with words. 3 days after the fire, Sarah Mitchell stood in front of the cameras. The press room in Sacramento buzzed with reporters, their pens poised, their cameras ready. On the table before her lay a stack of worn journals, faded maps, and folders heavy with evidence, everything Ethan had risked his life to save. She cleared her throat, steady but fierce. "These documents belonged to Henry Raven, an investigative journalist who vanished 16 years ago. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't obsessed. He was silenced." A ripple moved through the crowd. The name Ravenwood carried weight. An old ghost returned. Sarah pressed on, her voice rising. "SilverPeak Mining has poisoned rivers, gutted forests, and destroyed communities. These pages detailed bribes paid to state officials, contracts signed in secret. and threats made to anyone who stood in their way. Henry Ravenwood tried to expose it. For that, he was erased, his legacy buried. She lifted one weathered journal high for the cameras. No longer, the reaction was immediate. Flashbulbs exploded, reporters shouted questions, names of officials, corporations, board members exposed in black and white spread across every major network by nightfall. The storm that had howled over the mountains now raged in the halls of power. By week's end, SilverPeak Mining collapsed under federal investigation. CEOs fled the country. Politicians who had smirred for cameras days earlier now faced indictments. A machine built on greed and silence cracked open, piece by piece. And in that chaos, Henry Ravenwood's name was spoken not as a madman, but as a martyr of truth. The journalist who had seen too much and paid everything for it. Ethan watched it unfold from a distance. He stood on a ridge above Pine Hollow, shadow at his side, the wind cold against his face. The cabin was gone, but the mountain stood eternal, witness to all that had been buried beneath its snow. On Sarah's broadcast, Henry's photo appeared, serious eyes, a press badge clipped to his jacket, a man who had carried the weight of truth and been crushed by it. Ethan felt the echo in his own bones. He, too, had tried to bury his past, to disappear into silence, but silence only fed the darkness. Shadow leaned against his leg, warm and solid. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's head, a quiet anchor in the storm of memory. "He's free now," Ethan murmured. "They can't bury him anymore." The sun broke through the clouds, washing the snowfield in gold down in the valley. Pine Hollow stirred the town, scarred, but alive. And though the fight had left Ethan with nothing but scars and ashes, he carried something else. Too, a fire, Ravenwood's fire. The kind that could burn down lies and light the way forward, for the first time in years. Ethan Cross didn't feel like a ghost hiding in the mountains. He felt like a man with purpose, and purpose was enough. The fire had taken everything. The cabin that once stood firm against the mountain storms was now a skeleton of blackened beams and charred stone. Smoke had long since drifted away, leaving behind silence and ash. Where once there was warmth, there was only ruin. Ethan Cross stood in the snow, shadow at his side. He could still smell the soot in the air. He could still hear the crack of flames that had nearly swallowed him whole. But he was alive. Shadow was alive. And the truth had been set free. That should have been enough. Yet as he gazed at the wreckage, something stirred in him. He realized he didn't feel the emptiness he expected. Not despair, not loss. Instead, there was resolve. This land, this ridge, these pines, the mountains that stretched beyond was not cursed. It was never haunted. What people feared was the truth buried beneath it. And now that truth had been unearthed. Ethan placed a gloved hand on the scorched stone foundation. Cold, rough, but solid. "We'll rebuild," he said quietly. Shadow pressed close, tails sweeping the snow in a slope, the steady rhythm. For years, Ethan had drifted. A soldier without a war, a man without a place. He had run from ghosts of battlefields, from memories that refused to let go. But here, on this scarred patch of earth, he had found something he thought he'd lost forever: purpose. Not revenge, not survival. Something deeper, a home. Over the following days, he began to clear the wreckage. Timber burned, 2 useless stumps was hauled away. Stone was stacked. The work was slow, back-breaking, but it was his. Each strike of the axe, each shovel of snow, felt less like labor and more like healing. Neighbors from Pine Hollow came cautiously at first, bringing supplies, offering quiet words. Men and women who once whispered of curses now stood with him in the ruins, carrying beams, helping raise walls. Fear was gone. Respect had taken its place. Shadow never left his side, whether trotting through the snow with scraps of wood or keeping watch as the sun dipped behind the peaks. The dog worked as faithfully as any man. Together they built not just a cabin but a sanctuary. Weeks later, when the first wall rose against the sky, Ethan stepped back and let the sight settle in. It wasn't much yet, rough beams, a frame, but it was enough to prove that ashes didn't mean endings. They meant beginnings. And on the morning the final post was set, Ethan woke early. He stood at the ridge with Shadow beside him. The first light of dawn broke over the Sierra Nevada, watching the snow and fire and gold. The mountains seemed endless, eternal. Their silence, a kind of blessing. Ethan breathed deep, the cold air filling his lungs. For the first time in years, he felt weight lift from his shoulders. Not all of its scars never fully vanished, but enough to step forward. He rested a hand on Shadow's head. "We're home," he said simply. The sun climbed higher, and the two of them stood there, man and dog, survivor and sentinel, watching a new day rise. And in that light, the curse was gone. All that remained was a home.